model in which all concepts existed within a non-material realm. Every possible concept existed. Now, I asserted that this was a more defensible model of Platonism than the model in which only some concepts, things that we call abstract objects, existed, and other concepts, like essential properties, did not exist. So I said that it was more defensible to have all of these things as abstract objects and less defensible to have a distinction between them. I didn't actually provide an argument for why that's the case, and I was taken to task for that. So in this video, I'll explain why any distinction between concepts that exist as abstract objects and concepts that don't is arbitrary and problematic. So to start with, let's consider this version of Platonism that people propose. Now, in that model, abstract objects, such as the number 2 or possibly the laws of logic, they exist in some non-material realm, and we can reason about their properties on an a priori basis. That is, without any recourse to the material universe, we can come up with ideas about these abstract objects. For example, we can discover that the number 29 has a property that we call primeness or primality. That is, it's a prime number. Now, in this model, the concept of primality is not itself an abstract object. It is a property that abstract objects can have. Sometimes we call this an essential reproperty. I've heard it referred to as things like family resemblance or something. This is analogous to how objects in the real world can have a property of being green, but greenness is itself not an object. So far, so good. Now, my first objection to this is that dividing the non-material Platonic realm into abstract objects and not abstract objects seems arbitrary and motivated purely by analogy to the material world. That is, we look at the material world and we see that things in the material world are, some things are things and some things aren't. So we have objects and we have properties about those objects. Now, that's unsatisfactory to me because the whole motivation for positing this existence of a Platonic realm is that it contains things that we can reason about a priori. It contains numbers. Now, we don't need any recourse to the real world to argue about numbers. And to invoke the nature of the material realm, which we have no a priori knowledge about, as justification for a property of this Platonic realm seems to me to be wrong-headed. Now, that objection is not actually fatal, but rather that's the reason why I think you should be suspicious of this distinction, is that what we're doing is applying our intuition about the material world to this posited non-material Platonic realm, as if somehow that is a reasonable thing. Now, I can't think of any, other than that intuition about that's the way that the material world works, I can't see of any other reason why, in this Platonic realm, we should have objects and properties of these objects that are not themselves objects. So, what do I think is the real problem distinguishing between abstract objects and non-abstract objects? Now, consider the concept of bigness. Many Platonists would say that bigness is a property that concepts can have, or objects can have, but it's not an abstract object itself. Okay? Now, to see why this can't be, let's define more precisely our concept of bigness. Now, we can divide bigness into multiple size categories. Okay? The first size category, which I'll call SC1, size category 1, will be the smallest of these categories. So SC1 is a category which has an upper limit on how big something can be to have that property. So SC1 is a property that certain small objects will have. Okay? So small objects may have the property of SC1, that is being in size category 1. This is true regardless of whether anything in the real world actually has these properties. So this isn't an argument about the material world. This is an argument about the concept of SC1. So hypothetically, we can define and we can make arguments about size categories without knowing anything about the real world. There might actually be, the universe we exist in might not actually have anything that fits within size category 1. It might have no referent at all. In fact, the idea might not be meaningful at all in our material world. But that's not the point. The point is we're actually arguing about the concept, and the concept stands by itself, whether or not it has anything that it refers to. So, any size category, because there will be multiple of these, contains only objects smaller than a certain size. So the only objects that you could apply this category to are smaller than a certain size. And what that means is there's always going to be another size category that can contain larger objects. Now, might not necessarily, but it could. Let's call the next one up from size category 1, let's call it SC2. or size category 2. Now, at this point, anyone who's watched Anti-Citizens X's video on Platonism knows where I'm going to be going with this. So, SC2 must have another size category bigger than it. We'll call this SC3, naturally. Size category 3. And that has another size category bigger than it, and we'll call that SC4. And so on, and so forth. So what we have is an infinite sequence of size categories. SC1, SC2, SC3, so on and so forth. So far, so simple. Again, these are just concepts, and these are properties. These are essential properties that some objects may or may not have. Okay, so I'm talking about them as if they're sets, but sets and properties are exactly the same thing. The property is the membership function for being in that set. So, the question is, are these size categories abstract objects themselves? Do they exist in a non-material Platonic realm as abstract objects in themselves? So SC1, SC2, SC3, SC4. Are these objects or are these just properties? Now, I would argue they're objects, but most Platonists would say no, and here's the problem. If you say no, they're not actually abstract objects, they're just essential properties. And the problem is you've just asserted that numbers themselves also aren't abstract objects. Now to see why, we note that the size categories are simply the natural numbers 1, 2, 3, 4. That's why I defined them that way. I've named them SC1, but SC1 is just simply the number 1. Now you might say, but you were talking about size. Yes, but as I said, it had no referent. So it isn't about things having this size, it's just a concept. And I didn't actually define what size was. I didn't need to define what size even means. You may have intuited that it meant something about bigness or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have to do that. So SC1, SC2, SC3, so on forth, they have exactly the same definition and structure as the positive integers. In fact, that is the way that mathematicians define the positive numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, is based on you have one and each one has a successor, and so on and so forth. That is, I've constructed a set of objects that most Platonists would consider abstract objects out of a set that many Platonists would consider to not be abstract objects. So most Platonists would look at SC1, SC2, SC3 and say, no, these are properties. These are essential properties that some objects may have. And I've constructed a set of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, that most Platonists would look at and go, yeah, those are abstract objects. This is the fundamental problem with asserting that some things in our non-material Platonic realm are objects, abstract objects, and some things aren't. There is actually no basis for making that distinction. There's a naive, intuitive basis for making that distinction, but it's false. Now, you might object and you say, all I've done is show that a particular set of properties, size categories, are abstract objects, not that all such sets are. Now, that's technically correct. However, the argument I've just made can be extended to any arbitrary set of essential properties which have an ordering. What do I mean by that? Give me any kind of properties, doesn't matter what they are, greenness, bigness, birdness, primality, so on and so forth. I impose some ordering on it, just an arbitrary ordering. I say this one goes first, this one goes next, so on and so forth, and suddenly I've got a set of essential properties that is identical to the natural numbers. That's it. And so the same argument applies. Now, you might now say, okay, I accept that essential properties are also abstract objects. So things that are colloquially adjectives, properties that an object can have, I'll accept that those are abstract objects in themselves. But you haven't shown that other concepts must also be abstract objects. I mean, there are more concepts out there than just objects and properties. True. But we can actually take exactly the same approach with any other concepts. There's nothing about SC1, SC2 that was necessarily, nothing about the argument that relied on SC1, SC2, etc. being properties. They could have been any arbitrary concept. So as long as all the concepts we're talking about are discrete, that is, you can divide them into individual things, there's an infinite number of them, and that we can order them, even arbitrarily, then we can take exactly the same approach. So that is, as long as we can put these concepts, whatever concepts they are, that could be the qualia, it could be, the concept of the smell of the ground after it's rained. That's a concept, right? It's obviously not a property, it's hard to think, maybe it is an object, I don't know. You could take the colour green, the concept of greenness. You could take things that don't even have a possible referent. You could take square circles, right? This is a concept that can't possibly exist. We can still whack that into a set, and we can use, So as long as we can put them into an ordered set and we can define an arbitrary ordering, so we can just say, look, this one's going to go first, this one's going to go second, so on and so forth, with no reference at all to their actual properties. We're just putting them in order. We can show that that set is then isomorphic to the set of numbers, to a set of numbers, and thus these things must also be abstract objects. Now, I recognise that there are actually further arguments against this, but the only sound ones that I'm aware of actually rely on fairly advanced mathematics. And you can quickly go down the rabbit hole of talking about advanced mathematical arguments against that. And ultimately, I don't actually think that I don't think these arguments are actually worth making or responding to, because Platonism still fails to have any explanatory power in the material world, because it's almost always unfalsifiable and subject to Occam's razor. So to summarise, any attempt to divide the Platonic realm into abstract objects and non-abstract objects fails, because we can always construct abstract objects from non-abstract objects, showing that they're necessarily the same. Also, to reiterate, Platonism is not useful because it is unfalsifiable and unnecessary. Thanks for watching. See you next time.